So maybe
okay.
It's now 2 after. I know folks are, swimming here at this point on a long college walk. But let's begin. I'm Bill Solecki, so just as you might know from your schedule, there was a slight shift, not that it would matter that much in terms of who's chair, et cetera. But so I'm going to be chairing this session. I'm also the last presenter. We'll have 4 presentations. The logic will be that each... No, this is recorded. Yeah, I see. Sorry. Not that what I say is of any importance. This is live. Okay. So, Bill Solecki will be chairing. I'll be chairing the session. We'll have 4 presentations. Each presenter has been asked to speak no more than 15 minutes. If they run a little short in that 15-minute time, we can have time for a clarifying question. And then we'll hopefully sort of bring things to close shortly after 10 and then use the remaining time for kind of a group discussion and more extended Q&A. So to get right into it, I think we have a nice sort of mixture of papers within this session, sort of cross-cutting along a number of different lines that have already been kind of brought up in the conference. First up, we'll have Ray Zimmerman from New York University, Infrastructure Retreat in a Connected World.
Okay, thank you, Bill. So I've been at the Wagner School for decades and currently a research professor, and before that I was on the full-time faculty. What I want to introduce here is this, basically that we want to start from the right over to the right. We want to reduce the consequences of the effect of extreme events on infrastructure. That's the work I typically do, and we can either do that without retreating or with retreating or some combination of the two, and there are a number of elements that affect the consequences, the effects on infrastructure of extreme events. So just carving through these different elements, the likelihood, the sort of the risk elements, the likelihood, high risk of infrastructure being fairly vulnerable to these extreme events has to do with people being near the coast. Many of you may have seen this. I'm sure it's updated. People are, the number of people and population density has been going up. And these are some maps my students put together. Not only is the population going up, but the more vulnerable parts of the population, 65 and over and 85 and over, are moving more into areas with the red dots, which are hurricane prone. And secondly, we depend on infrastructure, and society is increasingly dependent on infrastructure. Whichever you look at with DOT or the Department of Energy, USGS with water, APTA with transit, our use and dependency is going up in general, and land consumption by roads going up. And the third area is that infrastructure is increasingly located along the coast. This is what we put in in one of the articles we did in connection with the New York Panel on Climate Change, whether it's power plants or CSOs, or this is just New York City, transit facilities, they're near the coast. Just adding to this, we've got rail transit, bridges and tunnels, and a lot of the rail yards, tunnels transit systems are all increasingly not only near the coast, but in or near connected with floodplains. And this is more of the same. This was actually published in the New York Panel on Climate Change, the third one, but it comes out of SIRR, the city's report. Now, infrastructure at risk, if you do a count of the number of facilities 10 feet or less above sea level, or 10 to 12, you come up with quite a number. This is just out of the 1995 hurricane study by the Corps of Engineers and some of the other agencies in the region. And as you can see here at the bottom, the airports are also increasingly affected by floodplains. And out of the book I did in 2012, Transport, the Environment, and Security, it's not only New York, which I've been showing, but there are many states. Obviously, Louisiana wins the prize with the most percentage of low-lying land. And then jumping to the city level, they're all expected to go up, the sea level rise by 2,100 over 2000, year 2000 levels, 1 to 3 to 5, even as high as 5 feet for Norfolk, Virginia. Again, jumping back to New York, 59 centimeters of sea level rise, puts New York City and North Carolina, parts of Florida, in pretty deep water. This is one of the more recent Mobile, Alabama studies that was done. On the right, you have just a natural system situation with storm surge depths for Hurricane Katrina, but on the right, you have, if you increase that, if you had 2 meters of sea level rise. Same for New Orleans, quite a lot of roadway infrastructure in the sensitive areas. I haven't done much with electric transmission here, but this is statewide for just New Jersey's plan. A lot of it crosses the coastline. This was an interesting study that EPA did. It's their climate indicators that lists how, the average number of flood events per year for some of the cities throughout the U.S., and the blue bar at the bottom for each city is 2010 to 2015, all going, all having higher flood events per year than in previous years. And what's interesting about all this is that it's all different. Every storm is different, has a different signature. On the left, here you see the flooded areas inundated by Hurricane Irene in 2011, but on the right, Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Some similar locations, but different patterns. Same with hurricanes, which also drive problems in the along the coast. I constructed these from what you used to be able to get from NOAA's maps, and for some of the major cities, again, the tracks, the patterns go all over the place, which makes it very hard to deal with. So the fifth thing, that center circle that I had in the first diagram, how is coastal infrastructure damaged? Well, transportation, it's sort of obvious: flooding, erosion, breakage, undermining of roads and rail, material destruction, closures, vehicle flooding, and electric power. This is just a couple of things, but there are many. Damaged transmission and distribution, underground lines, substations, and outages. And this gives you a picture of Hurricane Katrina, what I was referring to, where you have complete submersion of roads. This is from FEMA, and again, here, entrances and exit ways just impassable, and it's not only the roads, it's the vehicles as well. These are school buses. And now this is an interesting map that the 2007 storm report, there was a huge, massive flooding of 19 lines that had no service on the subways. And the red bars are the top 4 flooded locations, and we had similar storms in 2004, 2 others in 2007, and it keeps going up. One of the things that's hard to predict is that it's not the fact that the subway stations, the entrance and exits are in the floodplain or near them, but you know, the water rolls through the tunnels in areas that aren't flood prone and just locks up the whole system. This was an interesting picture here. Sorry it's so small. I was trying to cut down on the number of slides, but these are the water vulnerabilities detected across the New York City subway system. And transit damage, the famous maps, the whited out areas here were what were affected by Hurricane Sandy. November 3rd, 2012, October 29th was the landfall, and then by December 4th you had quite a bit back, and this is the famous South Ferry picture from MTA as well. The sixth thing that I want to mention that really is the work I primarily do is on interconnected and interdependent infrastructure. This gives you a snapshot of some of the major transit systems throughout the United States. I have similar ones internationally, but everything is kind of tethered, concentrated. You often have one node where everything comes together. New York City is kind of lucky because it has several nodes. Again, concentrations wherever you look. Road congestion, INRIX has identified bottlenecks. And these are conditions from ASCE. So the dependencies and interdependencies, this is, you know, what is it? A dependency is one thing depends on another, and you stop there. And interdependency is one thing depends on another, and that one depends on the first thing, or there are more complicated relationships. This is out of DOE's 2017 Quadrennial Energy Review. And this goes into the details of interdependencies within the petroleum and natural gas industry. Just zooming down to the subways, this is how the subways depend on electric power, and anytime there's a power outage, boom, you know, the subways are hit. We did an article back in 2007 looking at trends in outages. This is, it's in risk analysis, and this shows ever-increasing ones, and in addition, the durations have gone up since 2004 as well. So interdependencies after the 2003 blackout, you had transit taking 1.3 to 2.6, traffic 2.6 times as long once the lights were back. Water, similarly, Cleveland and Detroit takes a lot longer to come back even after the power's back. And this is a similar effect ratios. I can give people articles on this and what hits what the most. Water mains hit roads, gas more than the others hit them, and we developed a ratio of these effects. And similarly, water service will be affected by electrical and transportation. So these are, again, interdependent electric power and transit. It came back when the power came back. But the heart of this is we can do something. We have ways of approaching things. These are some traditional risk reduction solutions in extreme events. You know, they're recent, they're interesting, they're innovative, but fairly traditional. What I would propose is how would you mimic retreat for infrastructure? Sometimes you can't pull it out, but what you can do is depend on decentralized infrastructure for electric power. That's maybe solar, either within a flooded area or outside, and depend on these. And then for transportation, biking, walking, transit. For water, there are ways of decentralizing that, as well as communications. This is really the heart. What I'm saying is retreat takes many different forms. You can depend on things outside an area. And then altering travel modes and ITS, and securing financial support is absolutely key. There are many tools. I did have on the back, at the back, our green infrastructure paper where we mapped cost of green infrastructure and different financial tools. But and there's at the back of that in the appendix is a whole list of financing tools. But without that, we really can't get anywhere. So that's it. Acknowledging 3 of the grants we currently have. Okay.
We have a second or so for a clarifying question.
Yeah.
One clarifying question, otherwise we'll go on to our next.
Okay.
Oh, one. Quick. Richard, you won't ask a quick
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, I'll just ask a quick but hard one. So, I mean, the relationship to managed retreat, I'm in a way the question is partly is what you're trying to do achieve, deconstructing the infrastructure?
Yes, and depending on infrastructure outside of the area that's affected, so that you don't have to pull it back, you can just diversify it and make it more flexible. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so that obviously will spark lots of comments. The copy of the slides, we can talk about that as well.
Oh yeah, I'm going to give her a set.
Okay.
There's 1 or 2 pictures.
Okay, so next up we have assessing exposure and resilience with CRISP, the Coastal Risk Investment Strategy Program, and Charles Huyck from ImageCat.
Thank you.
And again, I'll do the same thing with the flash cards.
Oh, doesn't look very good here. Okay, yeah, so I'm Charles Huyck from ImageCat. ImageCat is an engineering company that does modeling of natural hazards, catastrophes, disasters. This is our This is our logo stew slide that I hate, but it does a good job of giving people an idea of the type of work we do and who we work for. We do research. We do work for AECOM. We've done work for NASA, National Science Foundation, a lot of insurers, basically developing boutique CAT modeling programs to figure out what happens after natural disasters. And one of the first things that we did, it started ImageCat, was started in 2000, founded by myself and my partner Ron Aguchi, was to look at the cost effectiveness of all mitigation efforts ever by FEMA. So this resulted in a famous study called 4-to-1 study. Obviously worked on it with a lot of other folks. That says if you spend $1 on mitigation, you get $4 back. So this became sort of a mantra for the mitigation community. And we've started to redo that in the last few years, looking at not just FEMA mitigation efforts, but other mitigation efforts. And one of the things that we did was look at the cost efficacy of building above what you're required to on the coasts to see if that's a good idea. And what we found is in some states, it's like 20-to-1. So for every $1 you spend, you get 20 back. And also, as part of the original study we looked at FEMA acquisitions in the floodplain. That was where that study has come from, and that's also extremely cost effective if you can reduce the repetitive flooding. So at the end of that, we actually had a model that modeled what the losses would be for exposure to several coastal hazards. And I'm not a climate person, but off the back of the earthquake work that we do, we started to take this to commercial real estate. So I'm just going to kind of go through quickly what we give to them as results. Hopefully leave some time for you to ask questions if you have any clarifying questions. But then, I think it's worth kind of exploring what the ramifications of having commercial real estate investors have this information and make decisions with this type of information, because I'm not the only one here. And lastly, also, we do a lot of work with insurance, and insurers have been interested in having conversations about this, but they renew policies every year, right? So it's not the problem. So if people think that it's their problem, they're wrong. They'll just their question is things like, okay, how fast should we get out of these markets? Some of the ones that are more forward-thinking are starting to talk about resilience bonds, but there's not any of those that have been put together yet. So that's also a big part of the problem. So there's three hazards that I model for the losses. Well, first is nuisance flooding, which I don't have to spend a lot of time explaining what that is here today, but it's got to be one of the most insidious disasters I've ever modeled, but persistent, right? It's there's no fatalities, but the repair time is just incessant. Once you get your business back up, it floods again a few years later. So that's one of the things we model. The other is hurricane storm surge. I think everyone's familiar with this type of damage. It's not really as bad for commercial real estate as it is for residential, because you've got steel frames generally, but the contents, cladding is obviously a lot of damage, and again, the business interruption, and then also the community disruption. And I think one of the more interesting things that we model is economic resilience. And it's difficult to do quantitatively, but we've come up with some indices that I think work pretty well in identifying some of the problems. So the way that we approach this, the way we sell it to the real estate investors, is if you've got one of these nice condos on the coast in Florida, Miami, this is Miami, it doesn't really matter if it's dry and if you're safe, if all the people who work there if their houses are flooded and you can't actually get there, right? And by the way, no one wants to go there anyway because the beach is flooded. So, you really have to think of this. This is a pretty clear one, and you really have to think of this more holistically. And there's a pretty severe example of this on the North Gulf Coast here after Katrina. I took these stills from Google Earth a few years ago, right? 12 years after Katrina, and this was clipped from the FEMA success stories. Boy, didn't they do this a good job here, right? They've got tuck under parking. The waves went right under. Maybe some cars got washed away, but they could have opened the next day. But here you've got blight. Here, 12 years later, no one's going to want to go to the beach there. So here's you've got people just parking and living. So you really have to look at these things more holistically. So we've tried to come up with some method to do that. So here's what the results look like for the first two categories. These are results that we give to the real estate folks. These are faked. The results don't match the stuff on the sides for obvious reasons. But we give them this just a simple perspective of what's going to happen if there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 feet of flooding given your property. And then we compute the losses. These are average annualized losses in dollar figures. We don't have to do any present value or anything because it's an average annualized loss, but to look how that changes decade by decade. And we give them a range. The low is associated with a 4.5 RCP, and the high is a 8.0. We drop off the 2.6. We don't think that's sort of a credible low for the path that we're on. We give them both the damage in dollars and the business interruption in days. And what happens almost all the time is you have this pattern where, it depends where you are, but the nuisance flooding is nothing, 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 and then extreme And then the damage from storm surge is exacerbated linearly, pretty much by the rise in sea level rise. You add those together, and then you get this pattern here. So that would be what it looks like for every property. You know, they might have thousands of properties. We screen it and give them this for, you know, the 100 or so that might be in an area of hazard. And then this is what it looks like in aggregate. Sorry, we don't have scales on here because we can't release the data, and these aren't to scale. But then here you have that same linear pattern with an increasing uncertainty as the decades go on, and then that same sort of logarithmic function for the nuisance, and then you put that together and you get your unique portfolio. And then they can break that down and look at where their most hazardous properties are and so forth, and maybe decide that they want to keep the one in Miami, right? But that's where we come in and do this economic resilience. And, you know, it's very qualitative, as I said. For every MSA, we go through and rank each community on a number of factors, including, you know, how transportation, if they're barrier islands, how mitigatable the landscape appears to be. And then just based on our arbitrary rank here, we say very high to low, and then tell them what their exposure is in each of these areas. And they take this pretty seriously. So one of the interesting byproducts of that we presented at AGU last year was we took the Microsoft Building Footprint database for the whole U.S. and intersected it with our projections of sea level rise for each decade, and showed how many billions of dollars are going to be in the 10% flooding class with the 8.5 RCP. And even at 2030, there's some that actually exceed $10 billion. And as you go through the decades, quite a bit more start to pop up in that area. And here's a nice aggregate chart showing, you know, where the worst areas are, where you've got Florida already looking at, I don't know what that is, $80 billion. But this descending list is quite nice. Florida, New Jersey, California, Louisiana, New York, Virginia. Okay, so quandaries, things to think about, concluding comments. I'm going to skip the first three because people that know more about these things have talked about them at the conference. But the salient things, I think, from the work that I've done that I don't think have been mentioned. The vulnerability assessments that I've seen for coastal flooding have really been focused on the 1% coastal flooding event on top of sea level rise, which I think is a way too long horizon for people to associate with. If the 1% is 3 feet and the 10% is 2 feet, 2 feet can be pretty bad in a lot of communities, and I don't think that people are really. I think if they understood that and were, you know, explained it to them in a way that they could understand it, that there might be some quicker action. And then the traditional insurance solutions to risk management don't apply. And I don't know if people really realize that insurers, you know, they don't want to leave markets. It doesn't look good for them. They like your premiums, et cetera, but they're not going to be forced into an untenable business situation either. So it's people who think, well, we've got insurance, it's a city that's not going to last. Okay. Maybe a few questions?
So we have time for a clarifying question, and then otherwise we'll go on to the next. Oh, right up here.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
At what point, sorry, does the interest insurance, like your last point, kick in for people? Right, so like, insurance.
At what point?
Yeah, when,
Like in time?
decision making, sort of the process,
When they can't renew their policy. You know, I mean, I think the bigger question is sort of when do we expect the shit to hit the fan? Is that sort of I mean, in my opinion, what's going to happen is there'll be something catastrophic that is going to be undeniably attributable to sea level rise, and one would think that has already happened, but I don't think it has. probably in Florida, where a lot of policies are dropped, and then you're going to have it dawn on people in New York, Boston, Long Beach, et cetera. So there's going to be some sort of cascading impact from that's always tends to be how decisions are made after disasters. Yeah.
Is there a way of extending this analysis to the effect on the real estate market prices, commercial real estate market prices?
That's a good question. I think that there has been some people doing some work in that. We're trying to do some research in that with some of these clients that have some pretty good data, but we don't have anything yet. Yeah.
Maybe just one more and then
Okay.
we'll move on.
Have you been following Finism push towards NIST 2.0 and how specific risks are identified for individual households?
I think I saw the RFP. No, I haven't.
I think that's where they're going. So I think a lot of what you've done is based on consumers learning push towards and
Do you have any names? A program name or just?
well, really, I mean, it's in its infancy. My understanding.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work being done right now to look at things like those connected.
I see.
And that rollout of that
I see. So this is the probabilistic hazards and so forth, maybe?
I think it's the probabilistic method of defining risk at individual household level.
Okay.
In addition to looking at AAL that
Maybe we could talk after. Be good. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, next up, so I'm going to be using the mic. Also, when folks ask questions, I think you're supposed to use the mics as well, so just somehow press those buttons. Okay, managed retreat, quote unquote, right? Practitioner perspectives, where theory meets reality, John Philipsborn, America's Climate Adaptation Practice Director, and from I've forgotten, AECOM, which is, I forgot the full.
With the acronyms?
Yeah.
Nobody knows.
Okay, no one knows. All right.
When I first started at one of our
I've heard it many
predecessors,
times, but it's sort of like, actually I was once at a conference where they had an acronym, but they didn't like they just kept the acronym, but actually they never explained what it was.
I
Maybe
think
that's
kind of where the industry's gone.
Okay.
My first boss used to say that at a previous one of the companies that AECOM acquired,
Right.
it was URS, and you would ask what it stood for, and he would say, it stands for quality, and he'd laugh, and he'd tap you on the shoulder. He thought it was the funniest thing in the world.
All right.
Okay, well, this isn't my presentation, so give me a minute to find it.
No, sorry.
That's okay.
It should be, yeah,
So we'll get rid of that,
it should be down there somewhere.
that,
And you just,
and
Yep.
that. Yeah, I'm surprised that there weren't more quotations around managed retreat. I didn't think that was, I guess this is such an accepted term. So again, my name's John Philipsborn. I work at a company called AECOM. I'll tell you a bit about them in a second. And I lead our climate adaptation practice for the Americas. And I was really grateful for the opportunity to speak when Alex gave me the chance to come and present. I was kind of with this caveat, I didn't have to have written a paper or published anything. I had the opportunity to come and speak more from a practitioner's perspective, if I can call myself that. But even more so, I got to get out of jail free card because it's not just my perspective that I was going to present. It was the perspective of a lot of my colleagues who work a lot in this space. So what I'm going to do is give you a quick download on what AECOM is and why I think it's important that we have an opinion on managed retreat, quotations or none. Then I'm going to share a few reflections from some of my colleagues who also operate a lot in this space from different geographies across the world. And then I'm going to kind of summarize with a few takeaways. So let's see, we have 2 clickers. Okay, so again, AECOM, we are a very large multi-service consulting firm. We plan things, we design things, we build things, we finance things, we manage things, and not at a small scale, but at a very large global scale. We're a very large company. We have over 80,000 colleagues. I have a very large Rolodex. We operate in 150 companies across the world. And we are very instrumental in just about every major city and most coastal spaces and across sectors and industries. So And we're not alone. We're not a unique firm in that. There are a lot of consulting firms like ours, but we operate in just about every aspect of life. And if you look at the very, very small fine print, not necessarily on this slide, but on our website and other places, you will see that we're actually very invested and involved in climate adaptation and resilience. And we do a lot of that kind of work. We work in cities, and we also work in the private sector doing climate adaptation and resilience projects. And so I think that's where we get a lot of this experience. But I think it's also very important to note that the majority of the 85,000 people that work at AECOM have nothing to do, certainly by title, with climate adaptation and resilience, but they're engineers of all different ilk. My dark secret is I was an English major, and I actually gave my first presentation in the less nice building behind this one at SEPA, so I'm a generalist. Most people at AECOM are not. They're engineers. And they're architects and they're designers, and they're the people that are in need of hearing all of the information from conferences like this. They're the ones that will, in the end, implement what managed retreat looks like. And so I think that's important to kind of remember and think about at conferences like this. How's the information that you all are working on getting to those people? So again, I took it upon myself. I got really excited. I'm an excitable guy. I love the topic. When I heard and learned that this conference was happening, I called all of these people that work in the same space as I do across geographies in Sydney, in Bogota, where our person who leads our Latin America resilience work, across the U.S., and I said, guess what? There's this conference on managed retreat. I'm going to be able to speak at it. I'm going to gather all this information from AECOM, and I want to share it. And so that's what I'm going to do here. And one of the first things I heard was, are you serious? A conference on managed retreat? Is that really what people are talking about? And again, what I was trying to do was get a sense from our leaders in climate adaptation and resilience, what they're hearing, both their own perspective, but what they're hearing from their clients. Again, we're working with these cities. What are the cities saying? So a lot of cities, it turns out, are aware. Our people are aware of this as a term, but this isn't the conversation that was happening on the ground. Climate adaptation, this is something that's happening in a lot of spaces. And so some of the themes that I heard from our people were, climate adaptation and resilience. This is very place-based. We've heard a lot about this over the course of the past 2 days. It really needs to be locally driven. Yes, some of the actions and strategies that we develop, that communities develop, have broader implications, but this is a very individual, almost personal process for cities and communities. So why is that? We've talked a lot about that and heard about that throughout the past 48 hours. Yes, vulnerabilities are unique to areas. Politics, don't think we've talked too much about that, but obviously local-based politics and policies are very critical to how this process happens. Stakeholders are unique. Cultures are obviously unique. Cities and communities have different levels of development in terms of the infrastructure that's there, also the population. So for all these reasons, population meaning it's both a large population and or small, it's connected or it's isolated. So all of those drive some of these thoughts and reflections. And we've heard a lot about that. However, there is this need to say at the end of these conversations, it can't just be a local thing. There's this broader group, there's this bigger picture that has to be involved here. All levels of government, all sectors need to be a part of this. No local community can do all of this. No local city. I mean, even New York needs help from these other levels of government to make this happen. And I think that's often forgotten, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. So again, I went to our different parts of the world to figure out kind of what's going on. I'm just going to reflect on a few of these. So we have supported cities, countries, communities in Latin America. And one of the things that I heard most regularly was, when you say retreat, we hear resettlement. And I think, again, we've heard a fair amount of this, and I don't pretend to be an expert in any of this, but particularly here. But there's this connotation that comes with retreat, it's very charged, and there's some sensitivities here. And so there is this discussion on whether or not, managed retreat as a term is certainly the best approach to get to the end results that might need to be gotten to in certain cultures. I mean, if the challenges are known, certain communities, coastal communities, are vulnerable, and we need to do something to make those people more safe, and perhaps some of that is finding different places for them to live. Is this the best approach to doing that? We even talked about some examples in which case there's a couple communities in Colombia where we've worked where there was a retreat or relocation that happened, and it turns out that there wasn't enough done in the first place to plan for that, and many of those people just ended up moving back to where they came from, but their houses weren't there. So, obviously there's a lot that goes into this. Costs come up all the time, but especially in kind of less wealthy countries when there are even more competing needs, more immediate needs, there's this question of whether or not this is even a priority that should be on the table. So we looked for several examples of where in Latin America this that we've been a part of that this has come up. Obviously, after the hurricanes, there's been a lot invested in resilience in Puerto Rico. There was a big planning effort that we and others were a part of called Reimagine Up Puerto Rico, which looked at 6 of the major sectors in the country and how they independently, but also as a collective, need to be more resilient to extreme weather events, to climate change. And we only found one specific recommendation of the very many recommendations that were created that actually touched upon something close to managed retreat, and it was one of 18 of the recommendations in the housing sector. Promote or incentivize community-driven voluntary relocation of households from high-risk and environmentally sensitive areas using land buyouts and rezoning for land conservation. So this is great to acknowledge. It's obviously putting a heavy emphasis on the community itself to make that determination. So I do think that that's an important recognition. Adaptation, very much being talked about, this concept of vertical retreat, if that's a term. It was also brought up a lot throughout here. So then I talked a lot with our folks that work in cities across the U.S. and internationally, and this is really kind of the bread and butter of AECOM. And we heard a bit about this, I think, a couple times in different presentations, what Mayor Bloomberg said after Superstorm Sandy, and that's the sense that I got from a lot of the people that work and support different cities, is that, are you kidding me? My city is not retreating. You got to be, you're fooling yourself if that's the approach that we're going to take. And I personally have never heard anyone in any sector or form of life win when it comes to the word retreat. I mean, you don't win elections talking about retreat. You probably don't win popularity contests either. So again, there's some fundamental terminology challenges I think we face. But again, that's the term retreat. In all of these cities, immediately after we talked about that term, we also, we heard that, well, adaptation and resilience, these are things being embraced and funded more and more and more. So then you peel the leaves back and people start thinking about the concept of managed retreat and focusing on this term managed. And so there's this opportunity for a phased approach to adaptation or retreat that I think is really important to talk about. And it brings up some really challenging questions about what should you retreat first, or what are assets that are more sensitive or vulnerable, or is it assets or people, and then how nature comes back in. A lot of talk about this vertical versus horizontal. A lot of recognition that we're allowing people and companies to invest and build in places that maybe they shouldn't. So are there some quote-unquote easy wins if you just remove some of the incentives for people to live in places? And again, this concept about costs. We're not talking about costs nearly enough. I'm sure some of you saw, but just yesterday, this research came out about the cost of seawalls. And so that's just one, and it was a simplified study, but again, this is just one cost of one type of adaptation. We need to be talking about costs of no action, the different types of adaptation, and then the costs of retreat. Just really quickly, again, that's the urban setting. We work in the remote and isolated places as well. Not all communities are the same, so there's a lot of individual elements that have to go into this. One of the things that we find is that even if there's a willingness by communities, even if there's a willingness and a funding stream, there's not often the kind of the management capabilities within a community and some of the synergies between a community and the funding stream don't exist for the communities to achieve those objectives. Okay, this is what you've been waiting for. Bold projection time. Think Wolf Blitzer. Think, election night. Hard topics are hard to talk about. So this is so simple, but it's really the crux of it all. We know a lot of this information, and the sea level rise, conferences like this really point out that there's a wealth of knowledge. How do we get that information to decision makers? But more so, how do you have those conversations not immediately following an event? And again, it's hard enough to talk about things like managed retreat post a disaster, let alone if it's on the outside. So some brief takeaways. I'll try to wrap this up quickly and we don't have to get into this. I'm not an engineer. I work with many of them, and I know there are some represented at this conference, but to me, this is the kind of community that really needs to be engaged in this discussion. And it strikes me that it's a kind of a wholesale mindset change. And this is again focusing on that concept of managed retreat. We struggle as a community, I think, to engage engineers just on climate change, on climate adaptation. That's a generalization. That's a general statement. But what are the things that we need to do to increase the thought process in the broad engineering community so that they're thinking about managed retreat? You're a roadway engineer. You've been taught as a community for decades that your job is to build a road that probably will last longer than you will. And how do we change that mindset so that we're talking about developing an asset, a piece of critical infrastructure that has a very defined lifetime, and maybe it has a lifetime for one purpose, but then maybe in 50 years the purpose of that asset, maybe it's a wall that then turns into a reef just by design. So how do we kind of change that thought process, talking about different scenarios, talking about different material choices, really ramping up the pace of inclusion of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And again, not to make generalizations, but how do we engage engineers? Well, you do so through standards. You do through procurement. You do so through education. Engineers respond to engineers. So how can they be taught about this a lot more? Another key missing element, I think, in this conversation is the private sector, and not private sector like consulting firms, private sector like large landowners, like utilities, like critical asset holders, like chemical companies. If you look at the entire Texas coast, it is just littered, so to speak, with large, very important facilities. And you look at New York, I mean, there's infrastructure and industry all over the coast. They need to be here. There are shared vulnerabilities. There's shared cost when extreme weather events happen or when flooding occurs. And there's shared opportunities to kind of combine efforts to kind of do more together. So just some final thoughts. I find that we're often at conferences, I'm at conferences where we're very excited about resilience. We give each other high fives and we say, great, we're working to be more resilient, but we forget that you have to be resilient to something. You have to adapt to something. You have to retreat, in this case, from something. So there's an increasing amount of knowledge about what we're retreating from, different sea level rise scenarios. We know them. But we have to be very clear about what it is that we're responding to or need to respond to and by when. And those are the things that I feel like we need to communicate more, not just internally as a community, but to communities, to private sector, to decision makers, so that they're aware about how those hard decisions need to be made. And then this concept of managed expectations. Again, I think that's a large part of where the conversation can go. Thinking about projects not as something permanent, but as something that buys us a little more time. Thinking about infrastructure as temporary, and thinking about some of the trade-offs that need to happen. So with that, again, thank you very much.
We have a moment for a clarifying question.
You spoke about the concept of vertical retreat, and I just wanted to ask you exactly what you meant by that.
Yeah, and retreat probably isn't the right term there, but this concept of, and it's really temporal, right? So, you know, maybe you're not retreating permanently forever to a whole different geography, but you're just changing kind of how infrastructure is, and it's certain infrastructure. And so, you know, are we moving certain things in one direction, or are we elevating other things? And, you know, is that part of the conversation? So vertical retreat, or just maybe that's called elevating, or it's adapting in certain ways, but it's part of this kind of concept of phased approach and a differing of opportunities that can be part of this. Managed retreat doesn't need to just be taking a community, picking them up, and finding a place inland for them.
Is that do we hold off, David, or is it like you must know now? All of it. Okay. We'll have discussion. We'll definitely have discussion. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure as us all to sort of try to keep to time, because then we'll have at least a chunk of time at the end to have everyone here, and David certainly will be brought forward. So I'm actually presenting next. So, and we have a timekeeper because I. Oh my gosh! No.
I'll reset.
Yeah. I'll tell you when to go. How about that? That looks different? Okay. So it's an interesting session. I think there's lots of different threads that we're talking about. I think as I've been thinking about the session, sort of a pivot point is certainly how individuals sort of interact with their environment and in a range of different things, and the things that they build, infrastructure, and different sort of understandings of that infrastructure. So this paper kind of, in some ways, I didn't sort of organize the session, so I can't kind of take the blame or the credit for putting this one in. It's a little different. It really sort of delves more closely into the questions of social science, particularly one type of social science sort of embedded within a couple of different sort of sub-disciplines within the field of geography, urban geography, and then hazards geography. And we look at sort of home, place, and dislocation. Myself, Aaron Friedman, who's not listed on the program, and then also Chris Cadieux. What we try to sort of look at here is there's certainly a lot of different sort of perspectives, from different disciplines with respect to how people engage with conditions of risk, questions of crisis, community transformation. And I think the larger issue of managed retreat kind of obviously very much directly kind of connects to that literature. We've been sort of hearing this a little bit over the last couple of days with respect to planning, obviously economics and so forth. A lot of that material embedded in it is this question of sort of normative thinking. Like this is how, if the world was, the systems were functioning, this is how, what an optimal decision could look like, and this is whether it's sort of economic or in the context of planning. It also assumes this sort of notion of rationality. Of course, embedded within social science is that people aren't, guess what, always rational. Bounded rationality, or they sort of operate and respond to a whole set of different cues. So one of the things that the field of geography has done, and there are other sort of certainly sociology, anthropology, a range of other sort of social sciences, have sort of, kind of taken that question of bounded rationality and looked at how cities change, how communities change, how individuals sort of operate within that. And I thought, I'm so desperately trying not to sort of, be a curmudgeon and say, well, we've talked about these things before in some different ways, but I think it is sort of relevant, at least at various moments, to sort of step back and take a broader look and to make sure that we're capturing all the literature. We heard already Susie Moser and others sort of saying, all hands on deck. We need sort of all the information, all the folks, all the different perspectives. So I thought it might be worthwhile to sort of take a little bit of a dive, a little bit of a drive, through geography and sort of talk about that. So how these different perspectives sort of played a role, particularly this issue of place attachment, and I think that's a big theme, as well as other sort of themes that have really emerged within geography that are now being brought into the realm of climate and what those issues are with respect to risk. And vulnerability. And of course there are those sort of fundamental questions like, under what conditions do residents decide to relocate? What are the most significant factors to relocate or not? And then when a decision is made, what factors influence when, where, how, and why, right? So those are things that are, at least in my mind, and I think, kind of recurring throughout the discussions here. Now, urban geography, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but basically it's about the process of city building, the connection between individuals, why they exist, how they're structured, and the concept of continual rebuilding. Every city, in a sense, and every urban area is in a constant state of rebuilding. And those histories and trajectories kind of are present today and leave legacies for the future. Issue of lock-in is really critical here as well. Hazard geography, of course, another sort of rich theme within the field, sort of looking at this question of how it is that places become, quote-unquote, vulnerable to populations and to infrastructure. What are some of the sort of decisions that are made? What are some of the responses, the hazard mitigation responses, and other sort of factors which start to influence this sort of variable vulnerability and that kind of rich landscape of that we see across the populations. So let me take a look, a quick minute at urban or place geography. A big issue here is this issue of affinity. How, we've already said, well, why do people want to live by the coast? How does, urban development take place? So there's a lot of literature, not to sort of, if you're familiar with this, I apologize, sort of showing you the obvious, but if you're not, it's really a very tremendous sort of rich literature about the concept of home and what that means to individuals. Obviously, anthropology has that, sociology, geography, particularly sort of from a very sort of rich, detailed perspective, try to understand the sort of emotional connection that people have with place. And even the concepts of how, changes within place can actually tighten people's connection to it if they sort of see it sort of, something better for them. And so this notion of affinity is not only sort of present, but it's also very, very dynamic. And of course, Neil Adger and others have recognized that this sort of place affinity is becoming ever more critical to understanding why and how certain adaptation efforts fail or not. And there's a former professor of mine, Mike Greenberg, and others sort of did this sort of really interesting study. I saw it 20 years ago. Basically surveying people, throughout the state of New Jersey. I live in New Jersey, so all joke, it's like I get it. But he went to places that are more distasteful in terms of like some of the aesthetics, and basically people love their places. They love their hometowns, even in really sort of troubled places. And so the connection is like how is this sort of place affinity so strong, even when there's sort of object issues of threat, in people's perspectives. And this idea of permanence also is really embedded. David Satterthwaite, I'll take him on board as a geographer, a very well-written sort of, urbanist globally. And basically he says places rarely disappear. They might sort of shift around a little bit, and of course we have the city of Erbil there. That mound is basically thousands of years of settlement. No matter what, Erbil is there, and that's the sort of the evidence of it. And that embedded in this sort of notion is this connectivity and community tie that is so rich that, in many ways, no matter what the sort of situation, it's going to be sort of an element in how people think about, and no matter how vulnerable the housing might be. And as I mentioned earlier, this idea of place lock-in, that's of course been most traditionally associated with infrastructure. We've got trillions of dollars of infrastructure, embedded in the coast. That's not easy to sort of, imagine changing. But in that also there are these sort of multiple sort of community connections, which also provide a sense of lock-in. And even in sort of local places, just through Jamaica Bay, this notion of living in places that seem sort of marginal has certainly been part of the history of the coastline of this city and continues to be. This is early 20th century. Jamaica Bay houses literally, hey, let's build houses out on the water. It's a nice place to be. And of course, there's also this notion, in the geographic literature, places could remain, but populations can change. And there's a variety of tragic stories in many communities where the population changes, conflict, social upheaval transforms the communities, but the buildings remain. We see that in lots of cases as well. The idea of placelessness is sort of interesting. Another geographer, basically his logic and others, the homogenization of landscapes, the sort of like continuance of landscapes. And one of the things that there's some little thread of literature, like what are places that people like, and how do they sort of escape this notion of placelessness? In some ways, the coastline is embedded in that idea of difference. And like, it's not a faceless sort of, urban sprawl. There's a definite sort of different bound, and that's why in some ways those coastlines are particularly have great affinity for people. There's also a rich literature about what happens when there's trauma in communities. Where do people go? Why do they go? What's the role of the state in this process? There's a tremendous amount. I don't want to, I don't have time, but to sort of whole issue of redlining and white flight, gentrification, racism is really sort of embedded in the urban fabric of many places, not only in the United States, but certainly, the United States is not the only place where racism as a practice transforming the urban landscape exists. And of course, we sort of look at the redlining process. The red areas are seen from the 30s as areas where there would be sort of potential for disinvestment, particularly African American or other sort of undesirable communities. And we see that legacy. There's clear evidence that the legacy of redlining still persists in the kind of the structure. And this idea of the shifting notion of demographics. This is Fort Greene, Brooklyn, a community rapidly gentrifying. In the 60s, the red line is the white population, collapsing with white flight. Where do those folks go? Well, they didn't move, to Albany or, very far away. They moved to what was usually in many cases sort of just outside into the suburbs. A very typical story, but maybe sort of reflective of this notion of where folks might relocate in the context of sea level rise and increased risk along the coast. And of course now we see Fort Greene sort of transforming, gentrifying, and sort of moving through another profile. Okay, gentrification. There's a gigantic literature on this. I really am excited by Jesse Keenan and other sort of folks picking up that mantra and transforming it into the context of climate. There's about 40 plus years of really rich literature about gentrification and how that process plays out. I think we're starting to see some of that appearing in the climate literature in the context of managed retreat and other sorts of questions of climate risk. But I think there's a lot more digging that we can do. The notion of of the capital flows, landscapes of contestation. Again, very much embedded in the idea that this is not a rational kind of normative landscape. This is a power contested landscape in which the role of the state is questioned. The role of even the capitalist system becomes sort of embedded in these sorts of issues of how landscapes of risk become built. And there's many different sort of buckets of theories. I know this is like big wash of urban geography and some other related social sciences, but there's rich literature that I think can really inform us about how this sort of constellation of interested parties, whether it's sort of developers along with some of the representatives of political systems, will start to already emerge and sort of contort and control some of the discourse as well as the process of potential retreat and change in the coastal landscape. Just in my remaining moments, I'll talk also about hazards geography. Why does loss happen? What's the best way to mitigate? And where are some places, or why are some places more vulnerable and people more vulnerable than others? This goes back, again, literally almost a century. Gilbert White back, looking at the floods of Mississippi in 1927, basically said, hey, if we build, infrastructure, if we build levees, guess what? That's not always the right decision. That actually enhances the prospect of vulnerability because it puts people, quote unquote, in harm's way. And that research, sort of, dissertation in 45, has concatenated and cascaded through a whole set of critiques about the process of the building of hazardousness. And there's a lot of different sort of threads and concepts that sort of play along this, the notion of integrated hazards, not just sort of, sea level rise that's going to be an issue in these communities, many other hazards that we need to sort of think about. The role of mapping and the power of mapping, what the mapping says about landscapes, the issue of risk perception, I think to me is quite central because I've seen a lot of increased focus on risk perception amongst individuals. Like, we heard this already many times. 2 years ago, people weren't talking too much about questions of managed retreat and sort of implications for real estate or financing, et cetera. Now it's sort of, telescoped to a much higher level. And a lot of that is embedded in this sort of shifting notion of risk. And of course, this idea of social construction, that things aren't, yes, there are some things that are inherently, quote unquote, more frequent to extreme events, but the context of how people get into those places and why they're vulnerable is a socially constructed process. I don't want to, run long here, but this idea, I mean, it's a fun quote, but basically, this is from almost 20 years ago. It's just assuming that low-lying locations are considered by definition maladaptive. Cities shouldn't be there. How do we do this? And basically, they're calling for integrating, this process very much embedded into the development process. Of course, we know that oftentimes doesn't happen. That the development process, particularly in the global south, but also in the global north, sends people and places people at higher risk. And that process is deeply embedded in how cities are built. The power of maps, I mean, with NPCC, we have a couple of members here, Ray and Klaus, and David as well, David Major. This idea of maps becoming sort of a way to sort of think about and present risk information. And also, while it's an informative tool, it's part of a normative process, it also creates an other, or places that are beyond the line and in some ways problematic. And the question the communities have, wow, I'm in this bad zone. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my investments? And we see that sort of writ large. Perception, I just want to sort of toggle through this. This was a study that we looked at, like how and when do people decide to move, and this is coastal New Jersey and also Staten Island. And there was a small sample, but about half were seeking a buyout and about half were staying. And we asked them, well, how long did it take you to kind of come to your final decision? Most of the people who wanted to stay knew it right away and never changed. The buyout folks really sort of vacillating, really going back and forth, and really were sort of like trying to figure this out. And so it was sort of in that process that we start to sort of think about, how their risk perception might have changed in the advent of policies and other sorts of things that emerge. This graphic just sort of illustrates an attempt to sort of start to weave this notion of the social construction of risk across the different development domains. I don't have time to sort of run through it, but it's just an illustration of a lot of work that's been done in this area. Final reflections. So how is this going to help us, or what relevance this might have? So I think, again, as I started, all hands on deck, all the social science, while we always assume and hope for issues of rationality and sort of kind of a normative view, it's very much not often the case. And so this idea of place affinity, place permanence, all these things about how and why people make decisions about staying, I think are going to be very relevant for managed retreat. And this urbanization process is highly contested. Managed retreat will be no different. And in some ways, we have to sort of be able to sort of understand that and kind of embed that in the process that we think about. This idea of hazards, the notion of risk perception, and again the social construction process. I think we need to sort of more effectively look at that. I think we have the adaptation wheels and all the various steps that we take. That unfortunately it's a nice model and goal, but we've already heard a little bit in some of the other presentations that isn't always the case. And I think the urban geography and hazard geography literature gives us a way to kind of talk about some of that stuff. A model attempting to integrate some of this. I want to just dive from that and say thank you, because I've already run out my time. And then maybe we can bring the panel. I'm going to shift back to my hair, my chair hat, my hair, my chair hat. Maybe with that, thank you. And then we'll get the panel together for our remaining time. No clarifying questions from me. So maybe Ray and other folks, Charlie as well. So we'll use our remaining time. We have about 20 minutes or so. And I'm sorry, someone is going to get the short block.
I'll sit there. That's better.
Yeah, the tallest person takes the shortest chair, maybe.
Is that right?
All right. So Ray, are we? So we will.
Where would you like to sit, Ray?
Oh, doesn't matter. Okay.
Okay. Yep, all live. So, sorry. So we're going to use this remaining time for either specific questions or general questions to the folks. Now, I know, David, I'm going to go right back to you. I cut you off. I knew that. I knew you were waiting. Yeah, please use, there's some button that you need to press.
Yeah, this is both a compliment to AECOM and a question. The compliment is that you guys did a sensationally good report on the mainland possibilities for relocating the barrier island community of Shishmaref in Alaska. The people, the Inuits on Shishmaref, wanted to move. There was no money, so this report has basically not led to this happening. And my query is, can you think of an example where you've done another really in-depth, detailed report for resettlement, where the resettlement actually happened?
I stopped listening after the compliment. Just no, I can't. And to your point, even, it wasn't just AECOM, but lots of folks have spent time thinking about Shishmaref, and there's been money, and so I think it's important to recognize that just the financing can't solve this alone, even though that's such an important limiting factor. But no, to your point, I spoke with our team in Alaska. We've done work in coastal parts of the far Arctic North in Canada that have similar challenges, and I have not found good examples.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on Shishmaref specifically, I was at a meeting called Rising Voices in May, which is at NCAR. It's an indigenous community-oriented gathering, and met Fred and a lot of the Shishmaref citizens. And it's an ongoing thing, and their concept of it is evolving. They're no longer really talking about retreat or resettlement as much as they are about site extension, which is a very interesting reframing because it enables them to maintain fishing rights and so forth. Am I not? Yeah. So, and it's also tied to the way that they think that there's a sort of seasonality to their settlement patterns where, they're concentrated in the wintertime, but in the summertime they spread back out to more family-oriented tracts of land. So, I think that I haven't seen your report, but it is an evolving situation. I just wanted to bring that to people's attention.
Great, thank you.
Hi, so I have a question about whether there's any kind of inherently resilient infrastructure. I think of offshore wind and how it's being built to be out miles off the coast, and there's going to be a need to update substations and things like that, and I'm wondering if that's an opportunity to begin some sort of retreat in that area. But then also coming back to perceptions, I had done some work at the Block Island Offshore Wind Farm with perceptions of fairness of process there, and wondering if there's some opportunity again to think about different infrastructure and how that might affect sense of place and how that might affect retreat, and will different types of infrastructure affect this differently? So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit to those two different thoughts.
Well, you've just done the amazing. You've linked everything together for the panel. Thank you. All right, who would like to? I think it touches on all our presentations in some way.
Yeah, the perceptions are really key here. My most recent research now, I didn't touch on it here, is how people behave with respect to, say, their use of energy, transportation, water, etc., and retreat. How they behave with respect to land, I think, is key. The only problem with that question and that area of research is that it's very unstable. You think of yourself, one day you'll think one thing, the next day you'll do another. You'll say what you believe you want to do and do another, and it's very frustrating. I mean, I guess if you have a large enough sample, you can of opinions and actions and behavior, you can get at it.
I will, just to follow up for a moment, I mean, the idea, again, you said that you're a English major or something like that.
Don't tell anybody.
Well, you were, way back when. So I was a geography major, but I was always interested in history, and then sort of it's brought this back into some of this perspective. So I'm always sort of fascinating, if you look, if you kind of flip the pages of urban design and urban infrastructure, the things that people objected to vehemently, violently, and now are sort of second place. I mean, even things like, living in a multi-story building. When they were building this neighborhood 100 years ago, people, and 150 years ago, people were objecting to sort of living so high up, 15 stories. So, and they saw it as sort of an antithesis of, what human life should be about. Maybe some still feel that way. But nonetheless, I think your question is really very relevant, because I think as we think about like the transformations that we're going to have to sort of enter into, whether it's sort of adaptation or mitigation, it will be a lot of physical change and landscape change. And historically, people haven't been really well kind of adapted to that process.
Hi. So to follow up on Christine's question, could you discuss a little bit more this tension between needing to have proximity to major infrastructure, the type that might need to be federally funded, and this sense of localizing and diversifying, and how do you mitigate between needing to have a port and having access to a port that is necessarily coastal, for example, or offshore wind, and decentralizing to safer locations?
I'm really in favor of decentralization. I hate to bring up New York again, but I have about 4 or 5 different ways I can get from my house to my job, just because of the diversity of routes. Now, it's possible that they could all be blacked out, but I think we're really going to have to think that way. And unfortunately, the economy is moving the other way. I mean, you've heard of economies of scale, and that's what's brought us to where we are now, with everything concentrating. And the airlines, with the hubs and this and that, you can walk through every kind of service that we have, and it's become markedly concentrated. There's just no way out, and I think we're going to have to really rethink that. Yeah.
Did you have a follow-up?
Yes, but go ahead.
No, you go. Yeah, sorry.
I think that's this important conversation of the phasing and the managing part of it, is that there are certain types of infrastructure which maybe should be kept in place or kept in place longer, but then there are parts of that can be peeled away. And maybe in peeling part of that away, we're again kind of reducing some of the incentives to have everything else crowd around it. I'm also recalling National Geographic did this great study of like what some of these new cities will look like, and some of the whether it's the sponge cities in China or just kind of new urban design that do have these hubs, but those hubs are located in certain places that have thought about this already. So if we can create these major transit, commercial hubs and put them in places that have already been placed there with all this in mind, then we can again pull the other parts away from these kind of higher risk areas.
One clarification, though, is important. Just because you decentralize infrastructure, it doesn't mean you're decentralizing people, because that you don't want to do. It's okay.
And that's a
yeah, I have to really emphasize that.
I just make a pitch for resilience modeling. I mean, I don't see a whole lot of people actually trying to identify the problem and where it's.
Yeah, I have a general remark and then a very technical question for Charlie. The general remark is, before we seem to take on retreat seriously, we often do first protection. And what bugs me is that we don't have a long-term vision for retreat. So we do often these short-term to mid-term protection measures, which then create a false sense of safety, where actually more investments comes into those protected areas. Look at New Orleans.
Well, that was the essence of Gilbert White's work. I mentioned where.
Yeah, well, but it was very much in the Riverian context that he.
Absolutely.
Yeah, And sea level rise, this is really now a major issue. And so we don't have a concept whether these short to midterm measures actually create new liabilities for the long-term solutions. So that's the general remark that I would like to hear some comments. And for Charlie, is your vulnerability still just flat elevation?
Is my vulnerability flat elevation? I'm sorry.
The fragility curves, is it just flat elevation, flat height, depth?
Well, we use depth of flooding and first floor elevation and FEMA damage functions stripped from essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying they're great, but, you know.
Could be improved.
Well, if you've got ideas, I'm all ears.
Maybe we'll respond to your more general point, Klaus, and then move on. Charlie, you want to respond to that?
I mean, I think that there's an awful lot of people that I think about Long Beach, where I'm from. There's a lot of people that are just their entire livelihood is just sort of invested in paying mortgages over the last 30 years. They got a great house, and the idea that you know, they have to move. Who's going to buy them out? No one's going to buy them out. If there's a short-term solution, there's an awful lot of political pressure to try to consider that, and it's going to be very difficult to take sort of a retreat mentality rather than a mitigation mentality when there's so much to protect. I'm not saying I disagree with you, but it's a very dire situation for the people that have decided to live not only on the coast, pretty far in. Yeah.
Let me, thank you. Instead of us all responding to that particular point, I want to embed it and maybe we're running closer against time, so maybe we'll take 3 questions and then we kind of respond. So you had your hand up, and then maybe I'll come this way. And then I apologize, maybe I'll go back over there.
So I think a lot of the presentations kind of talked around the fact that we live in an economy where, you know, private sector development is focused on short-term growth projections, not long-term kind of overarching 150 years in the future. And I'm curious whether in any of your work you've been considering kind of how we facilitate a transition to private sector engagement that lets people think along those longer times. It doesn't penalize companies for taking adaptive measures that aren't profitable in the short term. Because I feel like that's a big hurdle to making some of those shifts away from our current model.
And then we'll go back over to Les.
I work in New York City, and in a role where I see kind of small issues that make solar installations difficult, but I haven't studied what the larger impediments are and the kind of key impediments. And I wonder whether Ray's realization that solar is as much a resiliency measure as it is a sustainability measure may help frame solar and help overcome some of those impediments where it's not just supporting the grid, but it's really creating resiliency and diversification. But do you have thoughts on, like for AECOM, what the impediments are to solar in New York on rooftops, and then how that conversation could change?
So it's actually somewhat similar.
Yeah, exactly.
To your question. In this set, if we have more time, we'll do another set.
So in this conversation about making people think longer term or making action address longer term concerns, what is the role and responsibility of government versus the private sector, and how can we hold our elected officials and government officials accountable for making some change to standards that engineers have to listen to, that, you know, the private sector needs to respond to when they only think short term?
I mean, I have some thoughts on the private sector side of engagement, and I think it kind of ties into those 2 questions. I mean, one, you know, private sector, they don't have chief resilience officers. They don't have people hardly dedicated to just broad topics of sustainability. It's kind of embedded in different parts, or it's just a single, you know, person that does reporting. So, I mean, there's a challenge in finding the people that own this topic at private sector. However, you know, there are increasing extreme weather events, and private sector is increasingly regularly affected by some of these events. And so we are empirically seeing more private sector want to talk about this. Now, the challenge I find, one of the challenges I think that we all face as a community trying to kind of advance the topic of climate adaptation and resilience and retreating, is that private sector company is not talking about this with the governments in which they operate, own things. I live in Atlanta, and private sector has a very powerful voice in terms of what the city does. Private sector is not telling the city to fix roads that flood, but they should. Private sector is not telling the city that the grid is too vulnerable, but they should be telling them that. They're not talking about these things together. And yet they both share that same roadway that both is the entry road to Koch headquarters. And, if that road floods, then no one can go to work at Koch headquarters that day. And that's the, top 1 or 2 employer in the whole city. So Coca-Cola has an invested interest in that road and the, drainage system around that road. The city has an invested interest in that road, but also in Koch being happy. They should be able to kind of get together. Very simplified example of that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that it's hard to think of a policy solution or a government solution that's going to be more effective than raw economics. Once realtors are no longer able to flip commercial properties, that's going to they have a 7-year horizon, right? They keep on, when I present them the stuff, they're like, I'm going to be out in 7 years. It's like, good luck finding somebody dumb enough to buy the property, right? I'll say that, and they'll sort of sink in a little bit that it's not only that there's going to be a devolution of the cycle, but what I worry about is more, on the residential side, you have realtors really not wanting those maps out because they know that it'll affect property values. And there's been studies that have shown since they've started to publish the NOAA maps that those values have gone down quite a bit. So, I mean, I think that will create the pressure to think long term. And also, obviously, insurance pulling out, it's going to really...
I just think the challenge for us is there is a lot more talk on the real estate market, and there are people here speaking about it in the next session. And but I mean, that's us waiting for that to happen. And I think the challenge is, as a community, if we know that one day the real estate market will kind of reflect this, we shouldn't have to wait until then. And I mean, if you go to Miami, there's construction happening just out the wazoo. And even people here, professors here that study sea level rise and they make their living off of it, they're moving to Miami to be professors there. And so there isn't an urgency, and Miami's a great place to study this and to do these things. But I think we have to find ways to not wait for kind of that to shift.
Just wanted to not lose sight of what, Klaus brought up and a number of other, a theme throughout a lot of the questions is short-term versus long-term planning. Coming out of urban planning, I think, and certainly the climate planning, you're into many long-term planning, but really a lot of the private sector, a lot of people's thinking is very, very short-term, and they contradict each other. And I'm just raising that.
Yeah. I think I would just also add on, I mean, Klaus mentioned this issue of coastal versus riverine. Now, in the early 20th century, riverine flooding was like the big issue because that's, there weren't many people on the coast as much as there is now. Why are there more people on the coast? Well, mid-century, the federal government started a very aggressive policy developing coastal properties and, provided a lot of policy incentives to drive the real estate market. Similarly with the automobile, the advent of the automobile. I mean, this is I think we can't, I mean, the private sector is going to be central, but if we look at the past, it's always come coupled with a series of policy initiatives, which in many times, particularly in the mid-20th century, were driven from the federal level. So I think we just need to sort of recall that. The other quick thing to sort of keep in mind, it's an interesting sort of process and evolution. I'll just say a quick thing here. 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking about, well, what are the hammers, what are the mechanisms we can sort of control risk? And everyone was talking about insurance, right? And now we're slowly kind of moving beyond that. I mean, we're starting to talk about like the market. I know other folks, you know, are talking about like, you know, giving incentives to banks to sort of promote, you know, climate smart investments. So we're starting to sort of see a percolation through, you know, the capital markets. You know, the insurance industry was the first site of contact, but now it's starting to sort of percolate into others. So I think maybe that's a positive element. The question is it going to be fast enough, and will it be smooth enough without abrupt, like, you know, huge devaluations of coastal properties as we've kind of, you know, imagined potentially. So I apologize. I think I've sort of taken up all the last time. I'm sorry. I know, but I don't like to exercise those things. But does anybody have any like last moment, like I really need to know this, or I need to have this sort of brought up? Yes. Oh, yes. You were the gentleman. Okay. Excellent.
So I work in electrical infrastructure, and we deal with this quite regularly. So I'm wondering if you and your experiences around the world and in modeling have encountered this idea that you have to locate and centralize the responsibility for the vulnerable infrastructure within the communities that are vulnerable. Because generally infrastructure is paid for by the whole wider community, and if the infrastructure that's vulnerable gets destroyed, everybody pays again. So if you create codes and generally structure the market so that the vulnerable community itself is paying for its electrical infrastructure, it's islanded, and its own roads, its own sewers, and et cetera, the value, the taxes are basically going to go up, and they're going to be islanded there so that the rest of the people don't pay for it. And then the real estate values will go down, and people will naturally move out and eventually turn into a park and something else.
I mean, I guess one immediate thought I have to that is that sometimes if that quote-unquote vulnerable community takes more ownership or has the ability to take more ownership over that critical infrastructure, they'll become less vulnerable. And so, I mean, I think about the kind of microgrid concept. You know, some communities are vulnerable because they rely on this broader, you know, electric utility infrastructure or water infrastructure that is old and it's weak and it's vulnerable. And if that smaller subset community had its own microgrid, its own well that they maintained, then maybe by nature, you know, so it would almost have, you know, it had a positive impact, but perhaps reverse of the scenario that you're describing.
Great, and that's actually a very nice way to sort of, you know, thread in a lot of things we've discussed. I think so. So why don't we draw this session to a close? You know, obviously a very disparate sort of set of papers, but actually they're really kind of threaded together quite nicely, and the questions really enhance the strength of that. So thanks to the audience, presenters, great session. They've all been really, really good. I look forward to more today. I think there's coffee or something waiting for us, some delicious things outside the door. A surprise. So a little bit of a break, then we go in the next session at 11. Thanks all.